The story of America's most mythologized political family does not begin with speeches, elections, or crowds chanting a last name. It begins with property. With land chosen carefully, houses built deliberately, and environments engineered to shape behavior. Long before the public ever saw charm or confidence, power was being rehearsed behind closed doors. Inside private rooms designed to harden children into competitors, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. understood something most men of his era never articulated out loud. Political dynasties are not born, they are constructed. And construction begins with control of money, of image, and of space. Homes were not refuges in his world. They were training grounds. The Kennedy children did not grow up casually wealthy. They grew up observed. Their father measured them constantly, comparing siblings against one another, ranking intelligence, toughness, and ambition like assets on a ledger. Praise was conditional. Failure was noted. Weakness was unacceptable. The houses they lived in reflected this philosophy. Large enough to intimidate, ordered enough to suppress softness, public enough to ensure privacy never fully existed. In the summers, the family retreated to Hyannis Port, a compound that functioned less like a vacation home and more like a private academy. Competition ruled every hour. Sailing races, athletic contests, debates at the dinner table, everything produced winners and losers. Joseph Kennedy believed rivalry created excellence. What it also created was anxiety, silence, the permanent fear of falling behind. The children learned early that love was tied to performance. To disappoint was to disappear emotionally. To excel was to earn proximity. The houses themselves reinforced this. Bedrooms were not sanctuaries. Doors remained open. Movement was noticed. Privacy was limited. Even rest felt monitored. Winters told a different story. In Palm Beach, the Kennedy estate functioned as a gateway to elite power. The property was not merely luxurious. It was strategic. It placed the family within reach of financiers, politicians, and international figures who could accelerate ambition. For the children, it was another lesson. Wealth was not about comfort. Wealth was leverage. The Palm Beach house introduced them to a world where conversation itself was currency. Guests arrived carrying influence. Alliances formed over cocktails. Children were expected to listen, absorb, and learn. Joseph Kennedy ensured his sons understood how power moved through rooms before they were old enough to vote. Nothing was accidental. Everything was instruction. Yet this environment demanded a cost. Emotional warmth was rare. Vulnerability was dangerous. The Kennedy blueprint rewarded dominance, not introspection. Feelings slowed momentum. Doubt signaled weakness. Silence became survival. Rose Kennedy reinforced the structure in her own way. Devout, disciplined, and unwavering, she believed suffering built character. Emotional distance was interpreted as moral strength. Compassion existed, but it was formal, measured, and secondary to discipline. The children learned to endure rather than express. Inside these homes, identity was shaped early. The sons learned to perform confidence, even when afraid. The daughters learned that obedience preserved harmony. There was no room for deviation. The family's image mattered more than individual struggle. Joseph Kennedy's ambition extended far beyond wealth. Politics was the ultimate prize. He studied public perception with the intensity of a marketer. His children were not merely heirs. They were investments. Their lives were expected to scale upward, reflecting the family's rise. Any flaw threatened the entire structure. When illness, instability, or difference appeared, it was treated as a defect to be managed quietly. The homes that had been built to project strength now functioned as containment units. Problems did not leave the walls. They were buried within them. The dynasty's blueprint relied on a simple belief: pressure produces greatness. And sometimes it did. Confidence was sharpened. Resilience developed. Public charisma emerged. But beneath that surface, cracks formed emotional fractures that would widen over time. These houses did not create monsters. They created survivors trained to ignore pain. Pain had no function in the Kennedy system unless it could be weaponized into achievement. Otherwise, it was erased. By the time the public met the Kennedys, the foundation was already set. The confidence people admired had been rehearsed for decades. The unity was enforced. The charm was strategic. The houses had done their work. What the world never saw were the costs hidden behind manicured lawns and coastal views. The loneliness, the fear of failure, the constant comparison, the knowledge that love could be withdrawn without warning. The dynasty was ready to step onto the national stage, but it carried invisible damage with it. Damage that would not remain contained forever, because systems built on pressure eventually break, and when they do, the collapse does not stay private. The Kennedy children were not raised to explore who they were. They were raised to become what was required. From early childhood, competition was not encouraged. It was enforced. Every activity carried judgment. Every success was measured against a sibling. Every failure lingered longer than praise ever did. Mornings began with expectation. Afternoons ended with comparison. Dinner conversations were rarely casual. They were arenas where intelligence, wit, and confidence were tested in real time. Interruptions were common. Silence was interpreted as weakness. To hesitate was to lose ground. The children learned to speak quickly, argue forcefully, and never reveal uncertainty. Sports were not recreation. They were rehearsals for dominance. Sailing races turned into family hierarchies. Football games ended with analysis rather than laughter. Injuries were ignored unless they threatened performance. Pain was treated as an inconvenience, not a signal. Endurance mattered more than well-being. Affection existed, but it was conditional. Approval came when expectations were exceeded, not met. Praise was brief and often public. Disappointment was quiet and devastating. The absence of approval carried more weight than criticism. Children adapted by striving harder, not by asking for help. The family structure revolved around hierarchy. The eldest sons were groomed for leadership. Younger siblings learned their place by observing how attention flowed. Daughters were expected to support, not compete. Emotional needs were secondary to presentation. Appearances were everything. Privacy was minimal. Large houses did not mean personal space. Rooms were entered without knocking. Conversations traveled. Secrets were difficult to keep. This constant visibility created self-monitoring. The children learned to regulate themselves because someone was always watching. Religion reinforced discipline. Faith was not a refuge, it was a framework. Suffering was framed as virtuous. Obedience was praised. Questioning was discouraged. Emotional restraint was treated as moral strength. This worldview blended seamlessly with the family's expectations. The pressure produced results that impressed outsiders. Confidence appeared effortless. Charisma seemed natural. The children learned how to command attention and navigate rooms filled with adults. They became fluent in power before understanding its cost, but inside something was forming. Anxiety became normalized. Fear of failure embedded itself deeply. Self-worth tied itself to performance metrics that never stopped shifting. Rest felt undeserved. Joy felt temporary. When one child struggled, the system did not adapt. The child was expected to adjust. Differences were inconvenient. Sensitivity was dangerous. The family narrative allowed no space for deviation. To be different was to threaten the structure. The most damaging lesson was subtle. Love could be withdrawn. Not loudly, not cruelly, but through distance. Distance communicated disappointment more effectively than anger. Children responded by trying harder, by suppressing parts of themselves that felt risky. Competition did not end in childhood. It followed them into adolescence and adulthood. Career paths became extensions of childhood contests. Approval remained scarce. Even achievements felt provisional, always subject to comparison. This environment created remarkable public performers. It also created emotional isolation. The children learned how to win crowds while feeling unseen privately. They mastered control while losing access to vulnerability. The dynasty projected unity, but unity was enforced, not organic. Conflict was hidden. Pain was buried. The image remained intact because fractures were managed internally. At great cost, by the time the Kennedy children stepped into public life, they carried confidence shaped by pressure and wounds shaped by silence. They were admired for traits forged in an environment that never allowed them to rest. The cost of that upbringing would surface later. In moments when control failed and consequences became impossible to contain, the blueprint had created winners. It had also created fragility disguised as strength. This was the price of raising winners at any cost. As the children aged, the stakes intensified. Adolescence did not bring relief. It brought scrutiny. Romantic interests were evaluated for suitability. Friendships were measured by usefulness. Independence was permitted only when it aligned with the family's long-term objectives. Emotional experimentation, a normal part of growing up, became a liability. Mistakes were remembered. The family possessed a long institutional memory. An error could follow a child for years, resurfacing as a cautionary example during moments of comparison. Success did not erase past shortcomings. It merely postponed judgment. The home environment taught one overriding rule: never embarrass the family. Public perception mattered more than private truth. Problems were to be solved quietly or hidden completely. Asking for outside help suggested failure of the system itself, which was unacceptable. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The children learned to conceal struggle. Physical illness might be tolerated, but emotional distress was treated as weakness. Silence became protection. Humor became camouflage. Confidence became armor. Even moments meant for celebration carried tension. Holidays brought together all siblings under the same roof, reactivating old hierarchies. Achievement was acknowledged selectively. Competition never truly paused. The presence of extended family and guests only heightened the performance. In this environment, identity narrowed. Children became roles rather than individuals. The leader, the supporter, the disappointment. These labels formed early and hardened over time. Escaping them required rebellion, and rebellion carried consequences. Outsiders often misread the dynamic. They saw privilege and assumed ease. They saw confidence and assumed security. What they did not see was the constant internal audit each child performed. Measuring themselves against impossible standards, the system worked as long as obedience remained intact. But pressure accumulates. Suppressed emotion does not disappear. It waits. The very traits that created public admiration also limited resilience. When tragedy struck, this upbringing did not guarantee collapse, but it made collapse catastrophic when it arrived. The family had no language for vulnerability, no tools for repair. Only strategies for containment. Raising winners had succeeded, but it had also created adults unprepared for loss, failure, or grief that could not be managed quietly, and history would soon test them in ways no blueprint could control. Those missing tools would matter later, when success no longer shielded them, and the costs of silence became impossible to deny publicly across the nation and world. If Hyannis Port was where the Kennedy children were hardened, Palm Beach was where they were displayed. Winter transformed the family from an internal machine into a public force. The estate in Florida did not exist for relaxation. It existed for access. Every season, the family stepped into a world where proximity to power mattered more than titles, and where influence was exchanged quietly over dinners, drinks, and introductions. Palm Beach operated like a seasonal capital. For a few concentrated months, America's wealth and authority compressed into a narrow strip of coastline. Financiers, diplomats, industrialists, politicians, and foreign guests arrived not for leisure, but for positioning. To be seen there meant relevance. To be welcomed inside the right homes meant opportunity. The Kennedy house was one of those homes. From the moment guests arrived, the environment communicated intention. This was not a family retreat. It was a controlled arena. Conversation was never casual. Seating was deliberate. Timing mattered. Children were present not as dependents, but as apprentices. They listened. They watched. They learned how adults negotiated power without appearing to negotiate at all. Joseph Kennedy understood that influence often moved faster through living rooms than through institutions. Formal power required votes and laws. Informal power required access and trust. Palm Beach offered both in concentrated form, and his children were expected to absorb this lesson early. The Winter Estate functioned as a rehearsal space. The sons practiced confidence in rooms filled with men who would later open doors for them. They learned when to speak and when to listen. They observed how charm disarmed resistance. They learned that control did not require aggression. It required timing. The daughters learned a different lesson. They were expected to maintain grace, support the image, and understand the rhythms of elite social life. Their presence mattered, but their agency was limited. They were not being prepared to lead rooms. They were being prepared to stabilize them. Every interaction carried weight. A careless comment could echo. A weak performance could linger. The children felt this pressure even when it was never stated directly. Expectations hung in the air. Approval was rarely explicit. It was implied through continued inclusion. Palm Beach also introduced isolation. Despite the constant social activity, emotional intimacy remained scarce. The family moved through crowds while remaining closed internally. Appearances were perfected, but conversations about fear, doubt, or exhaustion never surfaced. The estate was full of people, yet emotionally quiet. The contrast between Palm Beach and Hyannis Port sharpened the family dynamic. Summers were raw, competitive, physical. Winters were polished, strategic, performative. Together, they created a complete training cycle. Toughness at home, sophistication in public. But this duality carried consequences. The children learned to switch personas depending on setting. Vulnerability was suppressed in both environments, but for different reasons. At home, it disrupted discipline. In Palm Beach, it disrupted image. The family's public unity grew stronger as a result. Outsiders saw cohesion. They saw confidence. They saw a family moving in synchronized precision. What they did not see was the internal fragmentation required to sustain that. Joseph Kennedy's influence dominated the Winter Court. He curated guest lists. He guided conversations. He made introductions that mattered. His children watched him operate with deliberate restraint, understanding that real power often worked quietly. Palm Beach also reinforced a dangerous belief that control could prevent catastrophe. The environment suggested that, with enough planning, enough access, enough discipline, outcomes could be managed. The Kennedys were learning to trust systems they built themselves. That belief would not age well, for now. The Winter Court rewarded performance. The sons grew comfortable around authority. They developed a sense of entitlement to influence. Doors opened. Invitations extended. Expectations rose. The path forward seemed inevitable, but inevitability breeds blind spots. The Palm Beach estate did not allow for failure in public. Problems were smoothed over. Tensions were hidden behind polished dinners and perfect settings. The family learned to mask fractures rather than address them. This habit became permanent. As years passed, the winter seasons blended together. The same rituals, the same faces, the same conversations, repeating with minor variations. The family's presence became expected. Their absence would have been noticed. Palm Beach helped transform the Kennedys from wealthy outsiders into insiders. It validated Joseph Kennedy's long game. His children were no longer merely heirs. They were emerging figures within elite circles. But this success came with a cost that was not immediately visible. Emotional insulation thickened. The family's ability to adapt to disruption weakened. Their reliance on controlled environments grew. The Winter Court rewarded predictability. It punished deviation. It reinforced the idea that image could override reality, that illusion would eventually collapse, because power acquired and protected. Spaces often fails when exposed to chaos. and the world beyond Palm Beach did not operate on seasonal rules. When tragedy entered the family's life, it would not arrive politely, nor would it respect social choreography. The Kennedys had mastered rooms. They had not mastered loss. Palm Beach made them visible. It made them confident. It made them connected. It did not make them resilient. And as the dynasty moved closer to national power, the gap between appearance and endurance widened quietly, waiting for the moment when no amount of charm, access, or preparation could contain what was coming. That moment was approaching. Rosemary Kennedy was born into expectation, not accommodation. From the moment she entered the world, she was measured against a standard that did not bend. At first, no one noticed anything wrong. Family photographs showed a smiling child, carefully dressed, standing among her siblings as if nothing separated her from the destiny being built around them. But time exposed differences, as her brothers surged forward, reading early. Speaking confidently, competing relentlessly, Rosemary lagged behind. She struggled to process information at the speed the family demanded. Her coordination was weaker, her speech slower. In a household where quick thinking and dominance were rewarded, hesitation became visible. The Kennedy household did not tolerate weakness easily. Achievement was not encouraged, was assumed. Anything less created anxiety, and anxiety demanded correction. Joseph Kennedy believed deeply in control. Problems to him were not conditions to be accepted, but obstacles to be removed. Rosemary became his first unsolvable problem. Tutors were hired. Schools were changed. Specialists were consulted. Each intervention was pursued with urgency, not patience. The goal was not Rosemary's comfort or fulfillment. It was alignment. She needed to fit the structure that had already been designed. She never did. As adolescence arrived, the gap widened. Rosemary wanted what her sisters wanted: affection, normalcy, but her ability to navigate social situations remained limited. She was eager to please, painfully aware that she was disappointing her father, and increasingly anxious about her own place within the family. Her struggles were not malicious. They were human. But within the Kennedy system, humanity without utility was dangerous. Public image mattered more as the family's profile rose. Joseph Kennedy was preparing his sons for political futures. Every detail of family presentation carried strategic weight. A daughter who could not fully control her behavior threatened that image. The solution he chose reflected both the era and his temperament. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, experimental psychiatric procedures were being promoted as breakthroughs. Among them was the lobotomy, a surgical intervention that severed connections in the brain's frontal lobes. Advocates claimed it could stabilize emotions, reduce anxiety, and make patients more manageable. The risks were extreme. The science was uncertain. The consequences were irreversible. Joseph Kennedy saw possibility. Accounts differ on how much Rosemary's mother understood about what was being planned. What is clear is that the decision was not a family discussion. Rosemary herself had no meaningful consent. Control replaced care. In 1941, at the age of 23, Rosemary underwent the procedure. It was a catastrophe. The surgery did not stabilize her. It destroyed her independence entirely. Her speech deteriorated. Her mobility was severely impaired. Her cognitive abilities collapsed. The young woman who had struggled but lived freely emerged unable to care for herself. Joseph Kennedy acted swiftly, not to confront the mistake, but to contain it. Rosemary was removed from the family almost immediately. She was placed in institutions, first in New York, later in Wisconsin. The official explanation offered to the public and, even to some siblings, was vague. She was working elsewhere, teaching, helping others. She would never again live at the family estates. She would never again appear in family photographs. She was erased. At Hyannis Port, her bedroom remained intact for a time. Then it became a quiet reminder no one acknowledged openly. Conversations avoided her name. Children were discouraged from asking questions. The message was unmistakable. Deviation from the family design resulted in disappearance. Rose Kennedy, her mother, eventually learned the full truth. The emotional cost of that knowledge was immense. But the family culture did not allow confrontation. Silence preserved structure. Acceptance replaced resistance. Rosemary lived the remainder of her life institutionalized. Separated from siblings she loved, denied the life she might have had if born into a different family or a different philosophy. Ironically, her fate influenced the surviving Kennedys profoundly. Years later, some would become advocates for disability rights, haunted by guilt and regret. But advocacy did not undo abandonment. The family moved forward. The estates remained active. Political ambitions intensified. Tragedy had been compartmentalized and buried, not processed. Rosemary became the first. Sacrificed to the dynasty's image, her story revealed something essential about the Kennedy machine. Success was non-negotiable, and those who could not contribute were quietly removed from view. Compassion existed, but only within boundaries that protected ambition. The silence surrounding Rosemary's disappearance taught the younger siblings a powerful lesson. Loyalty meant compliance. Questioning decisions meant destabilizing the structure. Survival required alignment. This lesson would echo repeatedly in the years to come, because once a family proves it can erase one of its own, it becomes easier to accept loss elsewhere. Death, scandal, and absence no longer feel unthinkable. They become costs. Rosemary's life did not end in 1941, but her place in the Kennedy story did, and as the dynasty advanced toward national power, the moral foundation beneath it had already cracked. When the family later spoke of curses, fate, and tragedy, they rarely spoke of Rosemary. Yet she was the beginning, the first empty chair, the first closed door, the first proof that the price of control could be permanent. The Kennedy family had prepared for competition, not catastrophe. For decades, Joseph Kennedy trained his children to win elections, to dominate conversations, outwork rivals, and outmaneuver opposition. But nothing in that training prepared them for war. War did not care about strategy meetings at the dinner table or carefully managed public images. It arrived without permission and took what it wanted. When the United States entered World War II, the Kennedy sons did what was expected of them. Service was not optional. It was part of the narrative Joseph Kennedy believed in. War would forge heroes. Heroism would translate into political capital. Sacrifice, if it came, would be symbolic temporary hardship followed by greater reward. Joseph Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, was the centerpiece of that plan. Joe Jr. was everything his father valued. Confident, athletic, charismatic, naturally authoritative. From childhood, the hierarchy had been clear. Joe Jr. was the future. John was the understudy. Robert was still forming. The rest of the family orbited around that assumption. Joe Jr. entered the Navy as an aviator, embracing danger with a sense of destiny. He believed, as his father did, that greatness required risk. Combat was not something to survive. It was something to master. Meanwhile, John Kennedy entered the Navy as well. Despite chronic health problems that would have exempted most men, he did not want to be seen as fragile. He did not want to fall further behind his older brother. The competition that defined their childhood followed them into uniform. In the Pacific, John's patrol boat was cut in half by an enemy destroyer. 2 men were killed instantly. The survivors were stranded. John swam for hours, towing a wounded crewmate by gripping the strap of a life jacket in his teeth. They survived. The story spread quickly. Joseph Kennedy ensured it did. Newspapers ran the account. Admirals praised the courage. John became a decorated war hero. The backup son suddenly had a narrative powerful enough to rival the heir. Joe Jr. watched this unfold from Europe for the first time in his life. He was being eclipsed. He volunteered for one of the most dangerous experimental missions of the war, a classified operation involving explosive-laden aircraft, all intended to be flown remotely into enemy targets. The mission was risky beyond reason. Mechanical failure meant instant death. But Joe Jr. did not hesitate. This was his chance to reclaim primacy. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr.'s plane exploded in midair over England before he could escape. There were no remains to recover, no body to bury, just fragments and silence. The telegram arrived at Hyannis Port the next day. Joseph Kennedy opened it alone, the Dynasty's foundation. Collapsed in an instant, the sun, everything had been built around was gone. The future president, the perfect candidate, the one meant to carry the family name into history. Rose Kennedy was at church when she learned. She returned home to devastation and met it with prayer. Faith had always been her refuge. It would become her armor. The family gathered at the compound, stunned. Joe Jr.'s room remained untouched. His trophies stayed on the shelves. His clothes hung in the closet. No one could bring themselves to erase him the way Rosemary had been erased. This loss was different. This one was visible, public, honored, but its impact was brutal. Joseph Kennedy aged overnight. The confidence that had driven him for decades cracked. The belief that preparation guaranteed outcomes was shattered. He had gambled on war and lost his best piece. John felt the shift immediately. The burden moved to him without ceremony. He had survived. He had become a hero. Now he was expected to become something else, a replacement for a brother who had always been larger than life. The guilt was crushing. John had not asked for this. He had not wanted to lead the dynasty. But the dynasty had no alternative, as if one death were not enough. Tragedy struck again. Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, had married into British aristocracy against her mother's wishes. The marriage was controversial, but briefly happy. Just months later, her husband was killed in combat. Kick was widowed at 24. The family wanted her home. She refused. England had given her independence. Hyannis Port represented control. She stayed abroad, creating distance the family found unsettling. The war was supposed to elevate the Kennedys. Instead, it dismantled them piece by piece. Hyannis Port became quieter. The competitive energy dulled. The laughter thinned. Dinner conversations lost their sharp edge. Empty chairs became unavoidable reminders. The family still believed in destiny. But now, destiny looked dangerous. Joseph Kennedy redirected everything toward John. Campaigns were planned. Narratives refined. The war hero image was polished. What Joe Jr. had been meant to achieve, John would now be forced to attempt. John did not protest. That was not how the family worked. The war ended, but its consequences remained embedded in the compound. Hyannis Port was no longer just a training ground. It was a place where the family learned it could lose and lose irreversibly. This realization did not soften them. It hardened them. Loss became something to absorb, not process. Grief became something to manage privately while the machine kept moving. Joe Jr.'s death taught the family a cruel lesson. Even perfection did not guarantee survival. And yet, instead of questioning the path, they doubled down. Because if the cost of ambition was death, then the only way to justify that cost was to succeed anyway. The dynasty moved forward over a grave. Kathleen Kennedy had never fit neatly into the structure her father built. While her brothers absorbed pressure and competition, Kick moved differently. She was warm where others were calculating, impulsive where the family prized control. At Hyannis Port, she laughed more freely than her siblings. She questioned rules instead of internalizing them. And unlike most Kennedys, she was not afraid of disappointing her parents if it meant preserving herself. That independence only sharpened once. The war carried her overseas. London during the Blitz was chaos. Danger and freedom all at once. Bombs fell nightly. Streets burned. Lives shattered. Yet in that destruction, Kick found space to breathe. She worked with relief organizations, moved among diplomats and officers, and lived beyond the rigid supervision that had defined her childhood. For the first time, she was not performing for her family. It was there she met William Cavendish. He was English aristocracy in its purest form: wealth, lineage, restraint, Protestant. Everything her mother distrusted and her father calculated around. For Kick, none of that mattered. What mattered was that he treated her as an equal, not as an extension of a dynasty. The relationship alarmed the family immediately. Rose. Kennedy objected on religious grounds. A Catholic daughter marrying a Protestant outside the church was unacceptable. To Rose, it was not just rebellion, it was spiritual danger. Joseph Kennedy objected for different reasons. He saw the political value of the match, but also the risk. A daughter acting independently, marrying without control, weakened the structure he had spent decades building. Kik married him anyway. The ceremony was civil, not Catholic. Rose refused to attend. The fracture was public and deeply personal. For the first time, a Kennedy child had openly chosen love over obedience. The marriage lasted for months. William Cavendish was killed in combat in 1944. Kik was widowed at 24. The family expected her to return home immediately. To Hyannis Port, to safety. To containment, she refused. England had given her something. Hyannis Port never had identity without surveillance. She remained abroad, living among her husband's family, finding belonging outside the Kennedy orbit. To her parents, this was dangerous. To Kik, it was survival. Her refusal unsettled Joseph Kennedy deeply. A Kennedy daughter, outside his reach, was unacceptable. Distance weakened loyalty. Independence threatened unity, and yet, there was nothing he could do. Then Kik met Peter Fitzwilliam. He was wealthy, charming, and married. The relationship was explosive. In Catholic terms, unforgivable. In political terms, disastrous. A Kennedy woman openly involved with a married man risked scandal at a moment when John's political career was beginning to take shape. Joseph Kennedy intervened directly. Accounts differ on the exact words, but the message was clear. End the relationship or face consequences. Financial support could be withdrawn. Access cut off. Family protection removed. This was not concern. It was enforcement. Kik did not back down. She believed Peter would divorce. She believed love justified risk. And perhaps most dangerously, she believed she had already lost too much to surrender again. In May 1948, Kik and Peter boarded a small plane in France, intending to travel south. The weather was unstable. Pilots warned against flying. The decision to proceed was reckless, but recklessness had become familiar to a woman who had lived through war and grief. The plane never arrived. It crashed in the mountains. There were no survivors. Kathleen Kennedy died at 28. The news reached the family like every other tragedy by message. A silence by gathering. Another child gone. Another life cut short far from Hyannis Port. Rose interpreted the death through faith. Her daughter had strayed. God had intervened. This belief allowed her to survive the loss without confronting its complexity. Joseph Kennedy reacted differently. Kik's death haunted him, not only because she was gone, but because their last interactions had been filled with tension, threats, and control. The warmth she brought into the family had been met with resistance. Now there was no opportunity to repair it. The family did not attend her funeral officially. Logistics and circumstances prevented it. Unofficially, attending would have meant acknowledging a life lived outside Kennedy rules. The family chose absence. Kik was buried in England, among people who had accepted her choices. At Hyannis Port, her absence joined others. Rosemary had vanished into silence. Joe Jr. had died in war. Now Kik, who had chosen independence, was gone too. The pattern was impossible to ignore, even if no one spoke it aloud. Conformity protected. Deviation punished. The surviving siblings absorbed this lesson deeply. John moved further into the role assigned to him. Robert suppressed doubts. Ted, still young, learned that survival required staying within bounds, even as he quietly feared those bounds might suffocate him. Kik's story became something the family did not discuss. Like Rosemary, she was not erased entirely, but she was compartmentalized. Remembered selectively. Mentioned cautiously. Hyannis Port continued to host gatherings. Smiles returned. Politics advanced. But something fundamental had shifted. The family had now lost a son to war. a daughter to independence, and another daughter to institutional silence. The cost of ambition was no longer abstract. It was personal. Joseph Kennedy still believed in the dynasty, but belief was no longer certainty. It was defiance, and defiance, once internalized, demanded escalation. The path forward required more pressure, not less. More control. More focus on the sons who remained. Because if the family slowed down, the losses would have meaning, and meaning was more dangerous than grief. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was never meant to be the one. That truth sat at the center of his life like a quiet contradiction. From childhood, the hierarchy had been clear. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was the heir. John was the spare. The family structure, the pressure, the ambition, all of it had been engineered around the older brother. John grew up watching, learning, competing, but always from the second position. He was sharp, observant, intellectually curious, but physically fragile. Illness followed him through childhood. Pain followed him into adulthood in another family. Those traits might have led him towards scholarship, writing, or a private life. In the Kennedy family, they were liabilities. Joe Jr.'s death changed everything overnight. There was no discussion, no debate. The crown passed automatically. John became the vessel for a destiny he had never sought and never fully believed in. He understood what was expected of him before it was ever spoken aloud. The compound at Hyannis Port transformed again, where it had once been a training ground for Joe Jr. It now became a staging area for John. Strategy sessions replaced mourning. Advisors replaced silence. The machinery of ambition restarted quickly, because stopping would have forced the family to confront what they had lost. John resisted quietly. He did not rebel. He did not refuse. He simply hesitated. He doubted whether politics was what he wanted, whether he was built for it, whether the price was worth paying. Those doubts were never voiced directly. They existed in his posture, his writing. His moments of withdrawal, Joseph Kennedy saw hesitation as weakness. The pressure intensified. John's war hero story became central to his identity, carefully curated and repeated. His injuries were reframed as evidence of resilience. His pain became proof of toughness. Nothing about the narrative was accidental. In 1946, John ran for Congress. The campaign was not organic. It was orchestrated. Money flowed freely. Connections were activated. Volunteers appeared in numbers no first-time candidate should have had. Joseph Kennedy treated the campaign like a business acquisition. Identify the market. Overwhelm competitors. Secure victory. John won easily. 29. He entered national politics carrying a name heavier than his own ambitions. Washington introduced him to a new kind of performance. Public speeches, private deals, endless expectations. He learned quickly, but never comfortably. Hyannis Port remained his anchor. The compound served as both refuge and command center. It was where decisions were made, where the family gathered to evaluate progress, where Joseph Kennedy continued to exert control. Even as John gained independence on paper, the gravitational pull of his father never loosened as his career advanced. The pressure to complete the image grew. A politician needed a wife, not love. A wife. Someone elegant, disciplined, socially fluent. Someone who could absorb scrutiny without complaint. Someone who would not disrupt the machine. Jacqueline Bouvier fit the role perfectly. She was intelligent, cultured, reserved. She understood image instinctively. Their relationship was not built on deep emotional alignment, but on compatibility with an expectation. The marriage satisfied the family's needs, even if it complicated John's personal life. When they married, the compound adjusted again. John and Jackie were given one of the houses on the property, just steps away from Joseph and Rose. Privacy was limited, observation constant. Jackie found the environment overwhelming almost immediately. The noise, the competition, the lack of boundaries, the constant presence of judgment. But appearances mattered more than comfort. Photographers arrived. Magazine spreads followed. Images of the young couple sailing, walking the beach, hosting guests. The Kennedy brand was evolving from ambition to inevitability. John moved from Congress to the Senate. In 1952, defeating an entrenched opponent from old political aristocracy, it was a symbolic victory. The outsider family had conquered insider territory. Joseph Kennedy saw confirmation, John saw escalation. With each step upward, cost increased. Physical pain worsened. Infidelity became habitual, modeled unconsciously after his father's behavior. Emotional distance grew. The marriage strained under pressures neither partner could articulate openly, yet outwardly. The compound became a symbol of success. Hyannis Port was no longer just a family estate. It was a political landmark. Invitations carried weight. Visits were noticed. The family had arrived, but internally, something fragile was forming. John lived with constant awareness that he was occupying a role designed for someone else. He carried his brother's unrealized future like an invisible shadow. Every success felt borrowed. Every failure felt catastrophic. Joseph Kennedy pushed harder as his own health declined. Time was running out. He wanted to see the presidency realized while he was still alive. By the late 1950s, the plan was explicit. John would run for president. The compound buzzed with preparation. Strategy meetings, messaging, media coordination, everything was calibrated. The Kennedy name, the youth, the war hero, the beautiful wife. The growing family, it all aligned. John complied. Not because he believed in the inevitability of success, but because refusal would have shattered the family's remaining coherence. He had seen what happened to those who resisted. Rosemary Kick, even Joe Jr. In his own way, obedience had become survival. As the campaign approached, Hyannis Port stood at the center of the operation. It was where confidence was reinforced, where doubts were drowned out by momentum. The compound projected stability even as internal strain intensified. John stood on the same lawn where he had once competed as a sickly child, now framed as a national leader. The transformation was complete on the surface, but beneath it lived a man who understood the cost of being chosen. He did not feel triumphant. He felt responsible. Because when a family builds a destiny around you, failure is no longer personal. It becomes unforgivable. Robert Kennedy needed distance from the place that had shaped him. Hyannis Port was discipline, hierarchy, and constant comparison. It was where his father's expectations pressed down from every direction, where winning was mandatory and failure quietly punished. For Bobby, that environment produced obedience, but not peace. He found something different in Virginia. Hickory Hill sat just outside Washington. A sprawling estate with a history older than the Kennedys themselves. It was not purchased as a symbol. It was acquired almost by accident, passed from John to Bobby when Jackie refused to live there. Yet once Bobby and his wife Ethel moved in, it became something no Kennedy property had ever been. It became human, where Hyannis Port ran on structure, Hickory Hill ran on noise. Children shouted through hallways. Dogs ran freely. Guests never knew if they would leave dry. The house was famous for one ritual in particular, at some point during a gathering. Someone, often a powerful visitor, would be thrown fully clothed into the swimming pool. It was not cruelty. It was equalization. At Hickory Hill, hierarchy dissolved. Ethel Kennedy made sure of that. She rejected the rigid Catholic discipline she had observed in Rose Kennedy's household. Instead, she encouraged spontaneity, Massines' laughter. Her home overflowed with children, eventually. Loving of a man, the chaos was not controlled. It was embraced. For Bobby, this was liberation. He had always been the most emotionally sensitive of the Kennedy sons. Where Joe Jr. was commanding and John was aloof, Bobby felt things deeply. He noticed injustice. He internalized suffering. At Hyannis Port, those traits had been liabilities. At Hickory Hill, they became strengths. The house reflected Bobby's internal conflict. It was joyful but intense, loving but restless. Political work and family life blurred constantly. Staff meetings happened around dinner tables cluttered with toys. Phone calls interrupted bedtime stories. The boundary between public responsibility and private life dissolved completely. Bobby did not want separation. He wanted integration. When John became president, Hickory Hill transformed into a parallel power center. Official meetings happened at the White House, but real conversations often happened in Virginia. Bobby was not just Attorney General. He was his brother's conscience, his enforcer, his confessor. They spoke constantly. Strategy, fear, doubt, ambition. After Joseph Kennedy's stroke in 1961, Bobby inherited more than political responsibility. He inherited emotional authority. His father could no longer speak clearly, could no longer direct the family. The gravitational center shifted. Hickory Hill mattered more than ever. Visitors noticed the difference immediately. Unlike Hyannis Port, which felt curated, Hickory Hill felt alive. Journalists stepped over toys. Diplomats laughed nervously before being pushed into the pool. Senators left dinners with wet suits and lighter spirits. The chaos disarmed people. Bobby understood that power did not always require intimidation. Sometimes it required sincerity. Hickory Hill projected warmth that the Kennedy image desperately needed after years of tragedy. But the house also carried darkness. The children sensed tension even when they did not. Broken bones were common. Hospital visits routine. The energy was intense, sometimes reckless. Bobby was driven, restless, haunted by the deaths of his siblings and the weight of unfinished purpose. He believed deeply in justice. Civil rights mattered to him in a way they did not to his father or even his brother. At Hickory Hill, he talked openly about inequality, violence, and moral responsibility. These were not abstract ideas. They were personal. The house became a refuge for Bobby's contradictions. He was fiercely loyal to the Kennedy legacy, yet increasingly uncomfortable with its costs. He served power while questioning it. He enforced law while empathizing with those harmed by it. Ethel absorbed much of this tension. She managed the children, the guests, the unpredictability. She believed deeply in Bobby's mission, even as she watched it drain him. Hickory Hill was her attempt to keep joy alive inside a life dominated by national crisis. When John was assassinated, Hickory Hill changed instantly. The laughter stopped. Bobby wandered the grounds in silence. He replayed conversations, regretted words not spoken. The house that had been full of movement became heavy with absence. His brother had been the axis around which everything turned. Now that axis was gone, yet Bobby remained. He stayed in politics not because he wanted power, but because he felt obligated to complete something left unfinished. Hickory Hill became a place of mourning and planning at the same time. Children played while adults whispered about the future. The contradiction was unbearable, but familiar. By 1968, the house was once again filled with campaign staff, posters, phones, schedules. Bobby resisted running for president until resistance became impossible. The country was unraveling. His supporters believed only he could heal it. Hickory Hill prepared for war. Ethel was pregnant again. The children sensed anxiety, but did not understand its source. Bobby moved through rooms with urgency, conviction, and exhaustion. The chaos returned, but now it was sharpened by fear. When Bobby was assassinated in Los Angeles, Hickory Hill collapsed into grief. Ethel returned to the house with 10 children and 1 unborn. The estate that had been built on joy now echoed with loss. The pool that once hosted laughter stood still. The rooms that once buzzed with debate fell quiet. She could not stay. Hickory Hill was eventually sold. Too many memories. Too much pain? The place that had allowed Bobby to be himself could not contain the absence he left behind. Unlike Hyannis Port or Palm Beach, Hickory Hill was not preserved as a symbol. It did not become a shrine. It faded, and in that fading was its truth. Hickory Hill represented the version of the Kennedy dynasty that almost existed, one grounded in conscience, warmth, and moral urgency rather than control. It showed what the family might have become if ambition had not required constant sacrifice. But it did not survive the weight of history. The house of chaos and conscience was temporary. Tragedy found it anyway. The moment John Kennedy took the oath of office, Hyannis Port stopped being a family retreat and became a stage. What had once been a private, compounded, loud, competitive, and inward-facing was suddenly the summer capital of American power. Cameras arrived first, then security. Then the quiet understanding that nothing at the property would ever be ordinary again. The presidency changed the meaning of space. Rooms, once used for family debates, became command rooms. Porches once meant for rest became backdrops. Lawns that hosted touch football turned into secure perimeters. The house itself did not grow larger, but its gravity did. Every visitor carried intention. Every photograph carried message. This was the height of the Kennedy image. Hyannis Port projected youth and confidence at a moment when the country wanted both. The president sailing in open water. Children playing barefoot near the shore. A first lady whose style seemed effortless and modern. The contrast with the gray austerity of previous administrations was dramatic and deliberate. Joseph Kennedy had imagined this decades earlier. Even after his stroke robbed him of speech, he watched from his wheelchair as the vision materialized. He could not direct it anymore, but he could see it. The dynasty was real. For John, the compound offered a kind of escape from Washington without leaving the presidency behind. He could govern from the coast. Secure lines connected him to the capital. Advisors flew in and out. Decisions were made between sailings and family meals. It looked relaxed. It was not. The pressure followed him everywhere. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Escalating tensions abroad, civil rights unrests at home, these were not problems that paused for summer. They came to Hyannis Port with him. He carried them into the same rooms where he had once competed as a boy. The settings softened the image, not the reality. Jackie experienced the transformation differently. What the public saw as idyllic, she felt as exposure. The compound's openness became claustrophobic under constant surveillance. Photographers watched every step. Reporters analyzed every gesture. Privacy disappeared completely. She retreated when she could. Travel offered relief. Europe, Greece, anywhere beyond the compound's orbit. Her absences were noticed and quietly resented by some family members who believed unity mattered more than comfort. But Jackie understood something essential. Image could not replace well-being forever. The children adapted more easily. Carolyn and John Jr. accepted the Secret Service as part of daily life. Agents became fixtures, neither threatening nor comforting, just present. Childhood continued, even as history pressed in from all sides. The compound thrived on contrast. Joy and danger coexisted. Laughter echoed alongside classified briefings. The illusion of permanence grew stronger as risk intensified. This was Camelot not because it was perfect, but because it felt enchanted, temporary, luminous, and bound to end. Joseph Kennedy sensed this more than anyone. He had built toward the presidency with relentless certainty. Yet from his chair on the porch, he understood the fragility of what he was watching. Power gathered too quickly invites attention. Attention invites danger. Robert became his brother's closest confidant during this period. With their father silenced, Bobby filled the vacuum. He moved between the White House and Hickory Hill, between policy and conscience. At Hyannis Port, the brothers talked late into the night. Strategy, doubt, responsibility. They understood the risks. The compound did not. Protect them from reality, amplified it. The Kennedys were no longer just participants in history. They were symbols inside it. Public fascination intensified. Images from Hyannis Port circulated globally. The president reading on the porch, Jackie walking the beach, children riding ponies. The narrative was irresistible. American royalty, youthful and modern, ruling with optimism. But narratives do not shield flesh. Security tightened, yet the sense of safety was deceptive. Familiarity bred comfort. Comfort bred exposure. The family had lived under scrutiny for years and learned to normalize it. The extraordinary became routine, that normalization would prove fatal. By the summer of 1963, the rhythm was established. The presidency felt stable. The future felt open. Plans extended forward: reelection, legacy, reform. The compound seemed to anchor the family against uncertainty. Then came the trip to Texas. The departure from Hyannis Port that fall was unremarkable. No sense of foreboding. No dramatic farewell. The president left, as he had many times before, expecting to return and resume the rhythm of summer power. 2 months later, he would not. The assassination in Dallas shattered the illusion instantly. The news did not arrive at Hyannis Port as a gradual realization. It arrived as rupture. Television screens, phone calls, silence. The compound filled again, but this time with grief. Rose Kennedy responded with faith. She went to church. She prayed. She accepted. The discipline that had carried her through earlier losses activated automatically. Emotion was contained. Routine preserved. Joseph Kennedy could not contain his reaction. Trapped inside a body that could not articulate anguish, he watched the footage again and again. His son, his achievement was gone. The culmination of decades of effort ended in gunfire. Robert arrived devastated. The house that had hosted power now hosted mourning. Rooms felt smaller. Hallways felt heavier. The laughter that once defined the compound vanished. Jackie returned briefly, but could not stay. Every corner held memory. Every photograph now wounded. She took the children and left, understanding that grief required distance as much as togetherness. The compound changed forever in those days. Security dismantled what it had installed. Communication lines were removed. The summer White House ceased to exist. Hyannis Port returned to being a family estate, but one marked by loss rather than ambition. The magic died quickly. Visitors came to pay respects, not to strategize. The press waited outside, quieter now, aware that spectacle had become mourning. The world had moved on. The family had not. The Camelot image persisted in memory, frozen at its peak. But for those inside the compound, the illusion was irretrievable. The place where a president had governed became a memorial to what had been. The dynasty had reached its summit and immediately begun its descent. The compound had done what Joseph Kennedy intended. It had produced a president. But it had also revealed the cost of forcing destiny into existence. The summer of power was over, and what followed would be darker than anything the family had yet endured. After Dallas, Hyannis Port no longer functioned as a destination, became a place people returned to because they did not know where else to go. The compound stood unchanged in structure, but emptied of meaning. The porches, the lawns, the water beyond the dockle of it remained exactly as it had been during Camelot. That continuity made the absence unbearable. Every space still expected a president who would never walk through it again. Grief did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments. Rose Kennedy absorbed the loss the way she had absorbed every loss before it, through discipline and faith. She returned to routine quickly: daily mass, prayer, silence. To outsiders, her composure looked inhuman. To her, it was survival. She had already buried 2 children. This was not new. Pain it was accumulated pain. Joseph Kennedy, by contrast, collapsed inward. The stroke had already trapped him inside his body. The assassination trapped him inside memory. He watched television replays of Dallas obsessively, unable to speak, unable to intervene, unable to escape. The man who had engineered everything could do nothing now. His power had ended not with defeat, but with helplessness. The compound gathered the family again, as it always did after catastrophe. Robert arrived hollowed out. He wandered the property alone, replaying childhood scenes against the reality of his brother's death. He walked the dock where they had sailed. He stood on the lawn where they had competed. Every memory felt unfinished. Ted arrived carrying a different weight, the knowledge that he was now the last surviving Kennedy son. That realization settled over him slowly, and then all at once. The expectations that had once been shared were now singular. The dynasty had narrowed to one person, and that person was unprepared to carry it. The compound did not offer comfort. It magnified responsibility. Jackie did not stay long. She could not. The house contained too many ghosts. She understood that if she remained, she would never move forward. The children needed a future that did not revolve around their father's absence. She left Hyannis Port for good. With her departure, the compound lost its final connection to Camelot. What remained was family history without direction. In the years that followed, the estate became quieter with each season. Gatherings grew smaller. Conversations softened. The competitive edge that had once driven everything faded, replaced by caution. Robert tried to carry forward what John had started, but not in the same way. He questioned power more openly, spoke about poverty, inequality, and violence with urgency that unsettled allies. He no longer believed success alone justified the cost. The compound saw this shift. Meetings there felt heavier, less confident, more introspective. When Robert was assassinated in 1968, the illusion of recovery shattered completely. Another phone call, another rush home, another body carried into history. Hyannis Port received the news as if it had been waiting for it. Joseph Kennedy did not recover from Robert's death. Whatever resolve he had left dissolved, he stopped eating, stopped engaging. The will that had driven the dynasty for 40 years finally disappeared. He died later that year. The architect of the dynasty passed away in the same place where it had been built. Not triumphant, not redeemed, simply finished. Rose outlived him by decades. She remained at Hyannis Port, attending Mass, greeting visitors politely, maintaining appearances long after ambition had lost its meaning. She became a symbol herself of endurance, faith, and quiet devastation. The compound was her world now. It's the place where everything had happened. It's the place where everything ended. Ted continued in politics, but the weight of legacy bent him. The compound no longer inspired confidence. It reminded him of expectations he could never fully meet and mistakes he could never undo. Chappaquiddick would ensure that. The dynasty did not end publicly. Kennedys remained in politics. The name continued. But the dream Joseph Kennedy had built, the vision of unstoppable ascent, was over. Hyannis Port reflected that truth. The houses were preserved, the grounds maintained. Tourists admired the view, but the energy was gone. The sense of destiny dissolved. What remained was history. Compound had witnessed everything: ambition, triumph, secrecy, sacrifice, power, grief, and collapse. It had shaped a family and been shaped by it. It had been a training ground, a command center, a palace, and finally, a memorial. No one spoke of curses openly, but everyone felt the weight. The Kennedys had not been destroyed by fate alone. They had been undone by pressure, control, and the belief that destiny could be engineered without consequence. Hyannis Port still stands. Not as proof of success, but as evidence of what relentless ambition can cost when it refuses to bend.